All right, so a very warm welcome to all of you from wherever you are joining us from. My name is Brian here. I'm the host of this program. This webinar today is part of an ongoing series by the LSE Hayek Programme, hosted by the Research Institute Stickert at the London School of Economics. The aim of this online series is to explore a range of topics that are related in some way to the contributions of economist F.A. Hayek. These include, but are not exclusive to, individualism and economic freedom, the nature and future of liberal democracy, social justice and welfare, decision making under uncertainty, macroeconomic management, the rule of law and justice. We are very pleased to have with us today Dr. Konstantin Kholodilin, speaking on the topic of rent control and housing regulations, which he is an expert on. He's a senior researcher at the DIW Berlin, an institute in Germany. He specializes mainly in the following fields: real estate economy, spatial econometrics, and time series analysis of the business cycles. So he will be speaking for approximately 40 minutes, followed by Q&A lasting approximately 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the questions that we receive. So you may drop your questions over the course of the presentation in the Q&A function. I will be holding on to these questions and will pose them at the end to our speaker. So please be aware that this webinar is recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube. So without further ado, I will pass on the time over to you, Konstantin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. I hope you can hear me
Yes, we can. Thank you.
and that you can see the presentation slides. So today we're going to talk about rent control mostly. We will also mention some other housing policies, but the focus will be on rent control. This is a policy whose objective is to improve affordability of rental housing. And as you can see in these pictures, the issue of affordability of housing is a pretty hot topic in many metropolises around the world. So you can see here the pictures showing people demonstrating against rising costs in different European countries, in the US, in Israel. And what these people basically require, they want the government to step in and to help them to improve, above all, the affordability of housing. So before we dive into rent control discussion, let me show you the universe of housing policies in order to see the place that rent control occupies in this universe. I will do it in terms of trade-off cross, because any policy has its intended purpose, and there might be other policies that work in the opposite direction, that contradict each other. Okay, so the first trade-off is between affordable housing on the one hand and decent and sustainable housing on the other hand. So when talking about affordable housing, we mean that people should not pay too large part of their household income on housing, or for example, in case of rental housing, that the rental burden or the ratio between rental cost and household net disposable income shouldn't be too large. Typically 30% threshold is used in this connection. On the other hand, the housing must be decent. So it must meet the current standards of quality. For example, it should be well illuminated, insulated. It must have bathroom, heating, air conditioning, depending on the region. Of course, the standards change over time. So nowadays, the standards are much stricter. The comfort is much higher than 100 years ago. But decency is basically guaranteeing that the housing satisfies these standards. Sustainable housing is the one that minimizes the use of energy and relies mostly on renewable sources of energy. And of course, when you try to make housing more decent, you improve the quality, or if you make the housing more sustainable, for example, you require that the housing has solar panels and so on and so forth, then you increase the construction costs and therefore the price, which leads to less affordable housing. So that's the first trade-off. The second trade-off is between owner-occupied and rental housing. So you know that might be that there might be different types of housing tenure. Owner-occupied housing and rental housing are like extreme sides of this palette of different forms of housing tenure. So for the sake of simplicity, I only show the trade-off between owner-occupied and rental housing. So in some countries, like in the US, home ownership is considered to be part of the American dream. And so the government spends every year billions of dollars to help people become homeowners. Okay, and it does it, of course, at the expense of rental part of the spectrum, at the expense of rental households. Now we can place all different housing policies or housing relevant policies on this picture. For example, in the Northeast, we have policies whose objective is affordability of rental housing. In the Northwest, we have policies whose objective is the affordability of owner-occupied housing. While in the South, we have policies that try to make housing more decent, more sustainable. By the way, can you see the mouse, the cursor? Okay. Now let me talk about a subset of policies, the policies that whose objective is to make rental housing more affordable. So here we have rent control, which is the policy that freezes rent or caps rent increases. We have here eviction protection, which is the policy that tries to protect tenants from being evicted by landlords. For example, it includes such measures as justified reasons for eviction. For example, if you don't pay rent for 3 months, you can be evicted. Otherwise, you may not be evicted. Housing rationing is another interesting policy in this respect. It aims at the most efficient use of the scarce housing stock. It implies, for example, that the demolitions of housing can be prohibited. It can be also prohibited to merge smaller dwellings into bigger ones because it reduces the supply of housing. It can be prohibited to convert rental housing to owner-occupied in form of condominiums. And it can be prohibited to rent housing short-term, like Airbnb housing, because it also reduces the supply of housing available for long-term rentals. As you can see, all these three policies are in red, which means that they are restrictive. Restrictive in this context means that these policies do not cost any single cent to the government, because in this case, the government only prohibits without investing money. So it's very advantageous type of policy because the government can simply prohibit something and claim that it satisfied the wishes of its electorate. By contrast, the other two policies are stimulating, because in this case, the government spends lots of money, billions of euros, dollars, or pounds every year to conduct this policy. One of these policies is housing allowance. As far as I know, in the UK, it's called housing benefit. It's a subsidy provided by the government to the rental household, in order to improve their affordability. So if we are talking about rental burden, so ratio of rental cost to income, housing allowance increases income because it complements the income and therefore reduces the rental burden. At the same time, it provides more flexibility to households, at least in some countries. They can choose better dwellings to live. Social housing is another type of stimulating measure. In this case, it's the landlord who becomes the help from the government, not the tenant. And the only condition is that the landlord lets housing to specific groups of households, for example, low-income households, and at a reduced price. Okay, so you see already that only this part, so the affordability of rental housing, includes 5 different policies. Each of these policies can have different objectives. it can also have different effects which interplay with each other, and the final net effect is very difficult to estimate. So you can see already here, and maybe you'll see it even more better in the end of this presentation, that it's very difficult to forecast, to predict the effects of housing policies. Now we are going to focus on rent control. I will talk about the geography of rent control, its history, its evolution, and I will finalize today's talk with effects of rent control. So the geography of rent control. As you can see here in this picture, there are many red-colored countries, which means countries that at some point had some form of rent control. Some of them had it for 1 year, others for many decades, but you see that there are almost no countries that didn't have rent control at some point of their history. Okay, so it means that rent control is a omnipresent or ubiquitous policy. Now, the history of rent control is also very long. So we find the first documented example before Christ in 49, 48 before Christ, during Roman Empire. You know that in Rome, multifamily housing existed. There were rental houses up to 7 stocks, where dwellings, mostly, I think, rooms were rented to low-income people. And in that period, we find the first case of documented rent control when rents were frozen for 1 year. Another example we find in another extreme of Eurasian continent in Hangzhou during Southern Song dynasty. As you probably know, in 12th century, the Song dynasty that occupied a large part of today's China territory, mainland China territory, was defeated by nomadic tribes coming from the north. So the rest of elite, the new emperor and his court, they had to flee southward, and they founded a new capital in Hangzhou. So that you can imagine that all of a sudden, the population of the city increased dramatically because there were many people from the court, their servants, bureaucrats, and of course this implied an excess demand for housing, because the supply of housing cannot be extended as rapidly as demand for it. So the reaction of the government in Hangzhou was similar to that in Rome. They froze rents for a certain period. There are many other examples of rent control episodes. I will mention just another couple of them. So you can see here probably different books, and this corresponds to the founding of universities. In Europe, starting from the late 12th century, many universities were founded, and the students, both students and professors in these universities, they were coming from outside the cities, from other regions or from other countries. Which means that when a university was founded, that created an excess demand for housing. Therefore, the statutes of all these universities included a provision according to which a special arbitration council had to be created. It consisted of both members of the university and of representatives of the city. Together, they had to set fair rents to be paid, to be fixed, and to be paid by students and professors of the universities. Another example that I'd like to mention here is Lisbon. Unlike all previous examples where we had a positive demand shock, so demand increasing rapidly, in case of Lisbon, we had a negative demand shock, so the housing stock was destroyed. How it happened? Well, it was 1755, the Day of All Saints, and many people gathered in churches when all of a sudden a huge earthquake happened. So many buildings were destroyed. Then it was followed by fires. And then if it wasn't enough, a big wave came from the ocean. It was tsunami. that completed this work of destruction. According to some estimates, 40% of housing stock in Lisbon were destroyed on one single day. And again, we have a problem because we have shortage, immediately we have a shortage of housing. And this led government to introduce rent control. By the way, maybe this example is also worth mentioning, the example of Madrid. It's similar to Hangzhou. So here we have to do with the movement of capital. So at some point, the capital was in Valladolid, and then it was moved to Madrid. At that time, it was an insignificant small town. And then over next decades, its population quadrupled. And again, we have a case of positive demand shock. But what is interesting is that rent control was introduced and it existed for almost 300 years. Okay, so here in the beginning, we have a case when rent control was introduced for 1 year. Here we have the case when rent control stayed there for almost 3 centuries, 300 years, which I think is a very interesting fact. So here we see many different cases of rent control until 1900. But what we can say about these cases of rent control is that they were mostly focused on specific cities, sometimes specific neighborhoods, and often on specific groups of population, for example, students. But in the 20th century, we have an explosion in the number of countries that introduced rent control. So here, for example, during World War I, we have over 60 countries that introduced rent control. By World War II, it was 120 countries, and it became a large-scale phenomenon. So entire cities were subject to rent control. Millions of people were protected by rent control. So it became really a mass-scale phenomenon. Here, by the way, we see an increase in the number of countries during the COVID episode. Now, over its history, rent control underwent different changes. So it didn't remain unchanged with respect to the first form that we observed during Roman times or in Song Dynasty China. And there are different classifications of rent control. So the simplest one includes 2 generations of rent control. There's also a scheme with three generations. There's even more complicated classification with 5 types of rent control. But I prefer to stick to the 2-generation scheme because it's simple and yet powerful. So here I will use the classification that includes just 2 generations of rent control. According to the first generation, the rents are frozen. There are different methods how to freeze rents. For example, they can be fixed at the level paid or prevailing on certain date. Here, as an example, I use August of 1914, which is the last month before World War I. And it was used in increase of rent and mortgage interest act that was adopted in 1915 in the UK. Okay, but you can find many similar examples from other countries. The rent can be also fixed as a percentage of fiscal value or taxation value of housing. This is the estimate of the value that's done pretty seldom, maybe once every 10, 20 years. So it's equivalent to freezing rents. The rent can be also frozen at a specific amount. Here, for example, we have 2 tables. The first table is taken from an Austrian law of 1917. Here we have 5 different types of settlements and 2 different types of dwellings. And you see that the monthly rent varies between 800, and not monthly, yearly rent varies between 800 and 3,000 crowns. This table is taken from Berlin's law from 2020, so pretty recent law. You see here 12 different categories of housing and the rents that vary between 4 and 10, roughly, euros per square meter per month. Okay, so 100 years passed, but nothing changed in the formulation of rent of first generation of rent control. As soon as the rents are fixed, you as a landlord may not simply raise them. You have to wait until the government issues a decree or an ordinance that will allow you to adjust your rent by 10 or 20%. In the meanwhile, all other prices can increase 50%, 100%, whatever. Sometimes the government can also decree that the rents have to be reduced. That happened several times in the history. The second generation of rent control is more flexible. So here we don't fix the initial rent typically. We use market rent, which is thought to be a result of free play of demand and supply, a result of free negotiation between landlord and tenant. But during contract, rent increases are limited. They are pegged to some measure of cost of living, for example, to consumer price index. There might be all different types of setting this cost of living, but the most widespread is consumer price index. Now, if we look at the current situation, we'll see that many countries do not have rent control anymore. These are blue-colored countries. Okay, in the US, there are some, at the national level, there's no rent control nowadays, but you have it in New York, for example, New York City, in some other regions. But at the national level, there's no rent control there. We see that the first generation of rent control is present in some African countries and some Asian countries, and that the second generation of rent control is concentrated mainly in Europe. Okay. Now, the question is whether we can measure the intensity of rent control. So it might not be enough to say we have the first generation of rent control, the second generation of rent control, because the differences in the intensity of rent control can be different. So you may have the second generation of rent control, which is very strict, and the second generation of rent control, which is very weak. So we ideally would like to be able to distinguish between different degrees of rent control, and not only across countries, but also across time. So here I'm going to talk about the ways how to measure the intensity of rent control. At the first sight, it might seem difficult because we use as our input data legal texts. And these legal texts in many cases are written in very complicated language by the people with a different mindset. I mean, I'm talking from the point of view of an economist. So for me, it's very difficult to understand what a lawyer is saying. So how to extract the numeric information from these texts? And sometimes I also have an impression that the lawyers design the complex or very complicated formulations of legal acts on purpose. But still there's a possibility to measure the legal information. There's a methodology which is called leximetrics, measuring laws, that it has been applied in different areas, for example, for labor regulations, financial regulations, but there are also quite a few studies that try to measure housing policies like rent control or land use regulations. So here I used one of such methods suggested by Jan Philipp Weber in his dissertation. He suggested to decompose rent control in 6 different components, and then to measure each single component. For example, the first component is rent level control. So we're asking ourselves, when we are reading the legal text, and we're asking ourselves whether it's the free negotiation between landlord and tenant in which the rent is set, or whether there is some specific entity, for example, a court or an arbitration council or some governmental entity that are responsible for setting rents. So if it's not landlord and tenant who are setting rents, then we have rent level control. The second component is about nominal freeze. So as you've seen in one of the previous slides, rent can be fixed in nominal terms, in money terms, like 3 euros per square meter per month. Of course, if all other prices keep increasing, the real value of rent is eroded. But if the rent is fixed in nominal terms, we have nominal freeze. Alternatively, the rent can be frozen in real terms. So we allow the nominal amount to increase, but not more than the overall inflation. In this case, we have real freeze. The fourth component is about intertenancy decontrol. It's mostly present in the US. I think I have never found it in other countries on other continents. So intertenancy decontrol means that when the sitting tenant goes, the dwelling is no longer subject to rent control. Finally, we have two components, one which is responsible for exemptions and another which is responsible for stricter controls. For example, in many rent control laws, you have new housing that is accepted from rent control. So the lawmakers say, okay, if we set rent control on all dwellings, both existing and new, then we're gonna destroy incentives to build, because the investors are not going to build if their revenues are limited. So they exempt new housing from rent control. In the last case, in the case of stricter controls, the stricter forms of regulations can be applied, for example, to specific areas, rent pressure zones or tight housing markets. That's nowadays very widespread in Europe, in Ireland, in Scotland, in Germany, Spain, France, and so on. It can also be applied, stricter rent control can also be applied to specific household types, fragile households, whatever it means. And it can be also applied to specific types of landlords. For example, in Spain and in New York City, the rent stabilization is applied to big landlords. Again, here there's a degree of arbitrariness, because in one law, we can say that big landlord is the one that has 10 dwellings and more. And then in the next law, we can correct it and say a big landlord is the one who has 5 dwellings or more. Okay, so there are no scientific grounds, scientific foundations for determining what big or small landlord is. But we find this in the regulations. And then we can, for each of these 6 components, we can build a binary index, which is basically a sequence of ones and zeros. It's equal to 1 in specific period t, for example, in year t, in country I, if the corresponding restriction is in place. So before restriction was introduced, the index is equal to 0. During the existence of this restriction, the index is equal to 1. After the restriction was removed, it's equal to 0 again. And then for each year, we can compute a simple average of all these 6 indices, and we get a value that varies between 0 and 1. 0 meaning the absence of rent control, while 1 meaning a very strict rent control. Okay, so together with my co-authors, we created a database that covers 135 countries and states, because in some countries you may have subnational rent control, for example, in the US, in Australia, in Canada, in India, Mexico, Pakistan. Here is the map that shows the country coverage of this database. For example, for India, we have several states, not all of them. For Pakistan, we have a couple of states. For Canada, we have several provinces. The period stretches between 1400 and 2024. The methodology is that of Jan Philipp Weber, and in my 2020 paper, I describe the way this database was constructed. And the sources are mainly primary ones, so legal acts. Here, by the way, if you click, you can get to my website where the list of all relevant acts is present. In some cases, when no legal acts, original legal acts were available, we had to use secondary sources. Astonishingly, for many Anglo-Saxon countries, there are no digitized archives of legal acts. Like, for example, in France or Spain, you have legal acts sometimes from starting in 1500 that you can free of charge read and analyze. For some other countries, it's impossible. So that in those cases, we had to rely on secondary sources. And to show you the variation both across space and time of rent control regulation, I will show you this little animation. So the yellow colored countries or yellow colored countries are those for which we don't have these indices. White means that there's no rent control. Black means that there's a very strict rent control. And then there are different grades of shade between white and black. So we start in 1910. And then with World War I, many countries start regulating rents. Then they begin deregulating rents. But then World War II begins, and even more countries join the club. After World War II, a long, lengthy period of deregulation begins, because it's very easy to introduce rent control and it's very difficult to get rid of it. Then in the 1970s, oil shocks happened that led to introduction of rent control, for example, in the US at national level. And then in the 90s, many former socialist countries removed rent control. Next wave of re-regulation came in 2010s, especially in Europe, so in Germany, France, and Spain. And the last episode that is reflected here is the COVID pandemic that led quite a few countries to introduce rent control. Now we are coming to the last part of today's presentation, and it's about effects of rent control. So we've seen the geography and dynamics of rent control. Now a very interesting question is, what are the effects of rent control? Because no matter which policy instrument you take, rent control, minimum wage, exchange rate policy, it has its intended goals, but at the same time, it has side effects. The side effects can both strengthen the major intended effect, but they can also go in the opposite direction, so they can weaken it. Therefore, the net effect can be lower than the intended effect. And it's very important to be aware of this if we are talking about introducing certain policy. And for example, in case of rent control, it's a policy that is often mentioned, especially in the recent period. And people who mention it, who suggest using rent control, are often unaware of its side effects. So now let us look at these side effects. So there's a rich literature on the effects of rent control. You can see here there are at least 186 studies that I managed to find. You see that there's a surge in the interest toward rent control effects in the last 5 years. And this whole period covers the last 60 years. There are many different effects identified. So the most prominent is rent effect, but also mobility, homeownership. But at the same time, you have such interesting effects as NIMBYism, homelessness, segregation, commute times, even crime, teen incarceration. So all these are effects that are related to rent control. The country coverage of these studies is pretty uneven. So more than half of the studies concentrate on the US. For some continents, you almost have no studies. So for example, for Africa, we have just a few countries, and for each of them, we have at most 2 studies, mainly 1 study. For Europe, the situation is a bit better. So here we have from 7 to 23 studies per country, but still it's nothing compared to the years. But the situation is changing. Recently, due to introduction of rent control in Spain, for example, in Germany, more and more studies started to appear for analyzing effects of rent control for these countries. So, and here we are coming to the last slide, which shows the effects of rent control. So remember that in the previous slide, we've seen that there might be 45 effects. Here I show only 11, because for some effects, we only have 1 or 2 studies. So for the sake of readability, I just showed the most prominent, the studies for which we have, the effects for which we have at least 9 studies or 8 studies. Red means the studies that found statistically significant negative effect. Yellow means studies that found no statistically significant effect, while green means studies that found positive statistically significant effect. So the first effect, this is the most prominent effect, is the effect on controlled rents. So controlled rents are the rents paid for controlled dwellings. Remember that typically in a rent control law, we have separation of housing market in 2 segments, of rental housing market in 2 segments. Controlled dwellings, dwellings subject to rent control, and dwellings that are not subject to rent control. So I call the first group of dwellings controlled dwellings, or dwellings with controlled rents, and the other group uncontrolled rents. We see that the vast majority of studies found negative statistically significant effect, which seems to be pretty much in accordance with the intended goal of rent control. So the goal is to guarantee the affordability by reducing rents or slowing them down. And that's what we achieve here, according to more than 60 different studies. But there are many other side effects. For example, we have a negative effect on mobility. Most of studies find a negative effect on mobility, meaning that people stay longer in the same dwelling. Well, here we can interpret it in 2 ways. So we can say it's something negative, because in this case, we have negative labor market effects. People stay longer in the same place, but they don't react to the labor market shocks. For example, the fact that wage somewhere is getting higher doesn't lead people to move there, because they're afraid that they won't be able to find dwelling, because there's a shortage of housing. And most probably, since people stay a longer time in controlled dwellings, it will be very difficult to find rent-controlled dwelling in another city. It can be also something positive. It can be interpreted as something positive, because you can say, okay, if we stay long time in some neighborhood, we build up a social capital. So we have neighbors with whom we communicate. We can be friends with them. We know the grocery vendor. So all these can contribute positively to our satisfaction. And when we have lower mobility, then it means that we are not deprived from this social capital. The next effect is negative effect on housing quality. So here again, most studies found, more than I think 3/4 of studies found negative effect on quality of housing. So the idea is here that if you are a landlord and your possibility to raise rents, to adjust them to inflation is limited, then you will try to find other ways how to guarantee that your rate of return remains unchanged. For example, you can reduce your costs, for instance, maintenance costs. Over the time, if you do not repair housing, it decays, its quality deteriorates. I will jump to the next effect, which is the effect on uncontrolled trends. And here we see that the effect is just the opposite to the controlled trends. So here the majority of studies found positive effect. So it means that if we have rent control, or if the rent control is strengthened, then rents for uncontrolled dwellings are going to increase higher than in the absence of rent control. For instance, we did a study on rent control or rent freeze in Berlin in 2020, and we figured out that the newly built dwellings were not subject to rent control, and there we had a stronger increase in rents, and also rents in the settlements around Berlin experienced a higher rent increase because this rent freeze was only present in Berlin. Outside of Berlin, in its immediate vicinity, there was no rent control, and therefore rents there increased even stronger. Another interesting effect is the effect on homeownership. So here we don't have this unanimous consensus as in other countries, in other cases, but still more than 50% of studies found that rent control tends to increase after introduction of rent control. On the one hand, it's due to the landlords trying to convert rental dwellings that do not deliver sufficient rate of return. They convert them to condominiums. On the other hand, it's tenants, typically newcomers in this city. They come, they don't find dwellings because the mobility is low. People tend to stay in the same dwellings. So they have either to rent expensive uncontrolled dwellings, or they have to buy housing, even if it implies that they have to make a large financial effort. And then we also have negative effects on supply, on construction, misallocation, a decrease in welfare, and we also have an interesting effect. The last interesting effect is on inequality. So here we don't have a complete consensus, but half of studies find that rent control leads to lower inequality because typically renters have lower incomes than landlords. And if you reduce the housing costs of tenants and at the same time you reduce the rental revenues of landlords, then you moderate the inequality between low and high income people. Here I'd like to stop. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I will be delighted to answer your questions.
So thank you very much, Konstantin, for this presentation. So ladies and gentlemen, we are now at the Q&A session. So please drop your questions in the function below, not the chat, but in the Q&A section, and I will select them accordingly and pose it to our speaker. Konstantin, perhaps let me just start with a question of my own. A few slides before you talked about the different effects that different papers mention, and then you have a word cloud over there, yes, at the top. And it includes things like teen pregnancy, domestic violence, and crime, right? So could you elaborate a little bit on how rent control could affect or influence things like teen pregnancy, domestic violence, and crime?
Yeah, well, there are not so many studies on this. There might be only one study that considers this
Yep.
effect. But the idea is that you are less, if you are living in the rent controlled dwelling, you are less constrained in terms of your expenditure. So you have more money available. Imagine you have to spend 40% of your income for rent. So then you will neglect many other important expenditure, or you have to work more in order to reduce this gap, and then you neglect your children. So, but when you have rent control, your rental burden decreases, and this frees your time and your resources for better treatment of your children. Yeah, I think that's the idea behind this effect.
Great. Okay, so we have one question here which asks, anonymous attendee, would the introduction of government-funded mortgages result in worse effects due to the lower mobility of people or give the developers bigger incentive to increase the supply?
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, I did study, or I don't remember. I'm not sure if I mentioned it or not. I have a study that covers more than rent control, that covers different housing policies, including mortgage interest deduction, for example. And the interesting result is that it's it has two major effects that are considered in the literature. The first effect is on the property prices, and it's positive. So when the government pumps billions of dollars in the economy to help mortgagers, either through subsidies or through giving up the taxes on the mortgage interest, income tax on the mortgage interest, then it leads to higher prices. But the second effect is on home ownership, and this effect is zero. So apparently, this policy is very inefficient. So you pump lots of money, and the only effect is price increases.
Right. So let me just ask another one. It may be out of the scope of your meta-analysis, but I'm thinking the political economy aspect, because you mentioned that when rent control is usually implemented, there is actually resistance to removing it after some time, right? So could you speak about some of the political economy dimensions about how rent control may have some sort of path-dependent, effect on policy? And how this persistence of path dependence could perhaps, exacerbate some of the unintended consequences that you described in your penultimate slide.
Yeah. Well, first of all, rent control is typically a policy applied in urban areas. And in many urban areas, you have higher tenant rate than elsewhere. So currently, the average homeownership rate is like 67% all over the world. But if you take only cities, then it will be much lower. So in some cities, you have majority of tenants. So you as a politician have to take into account their opinions, their interests. So this, even regardless of your political attitude. So even if you are from a liberal party, and in your program, in your manifesto, you are very liberal, still if you are interested in being re-elected, you will use policies that serve the interests of the majority of population, and that's what we find. Plus, when rent control once rent control has been introduced, people get used to it. So, and if it existed for a generation, then some people even were born during rent control, and for them, it's very difficult to imagine their life without rent control. So, it's difficult to get rid of something which you are got used to, and which you consider to be very beneficial. Because in many cases, people are not aware of all these side effects. So if you ask an economist, then he or she will say rent control is something bad. If you ask normal people, then they will say why not? It's something good. It's protection of ourselves, and therefore I think it's also contributes to longevity of rent control.
I think that's a very important point because I like to say sometimes that good economics is not always good politics, right? Because good economics, you can do the calculations, can do the policy research, but it may not sell in the political democratic arena, right? Which is
Yeah,
why there could be some sort of incompatibility.
yeah.
So let me just pose two more questions here from the audience. One anonymous person asked, you mentioned that rent control allows people a lower rent burden, which reduces issues such as teen pregnancy and crime. But studies seem to show that rent control reduces welfare, because I think in your slide you have one on welfare. How are these two impacts compatible? I guess what do you mean by welfare in that bar?
Well, it's important to distinguish between different market participants, because you not only have tenants, you also have landlords and you have homeowners. That's a very simplified picture, but we can take it as a point of departure. So when we are talking about welfare, it's the total net welfare of all these groups of people. So by increasing the welfare of some group of the people, you may at the same time decrease the welfare of other groups of people, so that the net effect would be negative or smaller than the one that you expected. Plus, it can also, the effect, you may distinguish between long-term and short-term effects. So, and they can be different. So with the time, for example, the quality deteriorates, in the very first month, you won't notice the difference in the quality, but after 10 years, the quality effects will become more prominent, and this also contributes to different measures of welfare.
Great. Okay, so next question by James, who asks, we've discussed fiscal implications of rent control as a form of regulation, but what effect does monetary conditions have on rent control, i.e., the base rate, I believe that's interest rate, increases, so mortgage payments need to increase. Are some monetary regimes more favorable for rent control? Are these located in particular geographical places?
Mm. Well, I'm not sure I can answer this question because I never considered this question. I mean, the effect of monetary policy on rent control. It's an interesting question setting. So in the future, I think I'll pay more attention to it. I know about studies that consider effects of monetary policy on housing market, but not about interactions of monetary policy and rent control. I also found some studies that consider the effects of monetary policy in one country on housing market in another country, but it's not what you're
Sure.
asking for.
Sure. Yep. Okay. Does abolishing rent control usually lead to significant increase in average rent?
Well, in general, there are different studies. So some studies look at the introduction of rent control, some others look at the removal of rent control. And typically, if rent control is installed, you have a decline in growth rate, for example, of rent. If rent control is removed, then you have increasing rents. But of course, the effects can also be asymmetric. So it's not necessary that you have, for example, when you introduce rent control, that rents decline by 10%, and when you remove rent control, they increase by 10%. It's uh, it's not something given. But indeed, when rent control is removed, you typically face an increase in rents.
Great. Okay. So the next one says, thanks for the interesting presentation. If you think rent control is not a good policy, but many housing policies, rental or purchase support, serve to inflate housing costs and make it unaffordable for many, what policy would you recommend to policymakers?
Mm. Well, I'm I think I'm wrong question to answer I'm wrong person to answer this question because I'm so much involved with different policies that, and I read so much about different policies that by the end of the day I know a lot, and this precludes me from giving some recommendations because I know that each and every policy has its positive and negative sides.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to say, okay, this is the policy that's less damaging. Probably, what I can say at this stage is that as soon as you're not intervening in the price setting in the market, the policy is to be preferred. So if it's not, for example, rent control, or if it's not housing rationing when you limit the use of different types of housing, then the policy should do. But you should be aware that every policy will have some side effects that not always will satisfy you.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a great answer because, it depends on what your policy objective is and what sort of trade-offs you're willing to make in different contexts, right? So, okay, next person asks, methodologically, is it reasonable to compare over time and geography with radically different policy designs, i.e., scope, depth of control?
Yeah. Well, I think it's can be justified. So I mean, we can say nothing is comparable and we just give up. We can say also that we we make some trade-offs. So there's a trade-off between, for example, the feasibility of measurement and its closeness to the reality. So we always have to make choices. So we can never make a chronology measurement that is both realistic and feasible. Because if you try to measure each and every characteristic of a regulation, then you will end up with you will not be able to do it even for one country. So we had to make some choices, and indeed we can be criticized that these indices are probably not very realistic. Plus, you can also say, by the way, it's autocritique that or self-critique that what we measure here is what is written in the law, but it's not the enforcement of the regulations. Because in many countries that I showed in one of the previous maps, for example, in Africa, hardly any person is aware of rent control regulations. There are surveys that show that just 5 or 10% of tenants are aware that they are protected by rent control in some countries, in Latin America and in Africa. But still, I think we can do this. If it's not good enough, we can always improve it. But I think it's an important step toward being able to measure the effects of rent control. And there are quite a few studies that are based on this data, where we consider, for example, the effect of rent control on homeownership, on inequality. And I think the results are quite interesting and reasonable.
Okay, so next question. Is it the nature of employment of majority of population that affect which generation of rent control is used, first or second? Example, in African countries, majority of population is primary sector, and most of the countries have first generation rent control, while European countries with majority in tertiary sector have second generation rent control.
I don't think it has to do with the structure of the economy. More it's more related to for example, to the degree of inflation. So if you have galloping very high inflation, then you are more likely to have some form of the first generation of rent control. Because even if you have second generation of rent control, people will try to to make the adjustment less quick. For example, in Spain, they use not consumer price index, but they use something like what they call competitivity index, which is a complex formula including price increases in other Euro area countries, so that by the end of the day, this index is lower than the national consumer price index, so that they have a kind of something between real freeze and nominal freeze, which is closer to the first generation of rent control. So I think it's more related to the economic conditions. So during pandemic, for example, of COVID, many countries froze rents, which was the first generation of rent control. It had to do with the economic crisis and also with price increases. So it has more to do with the overall economic condition.
Great. Perhaps let me just ask a concluding question to you, Konstantin. So you gave a very meta-analysis, large and study of rent control throughout space and time, actually. Is there a specific instance of rent control that has been practiced, whether in history or like in recent times, which particularly stood out to you in terms of its effects? Perhaps there was a case where the effects were particularly significant or severe that is worth highlighting.
Well, I cannot recall some specific example, but what I would like to mention is that I will return to the last slide. Is that here we have many different countries, many different generations of rent control, many different periods, and still the overall outcome is the same. So regardless of the generation of rent control, of its intensity, of the country and time period, the effect is more or less the same. Maybe the degree is different, but the qualitative effect is the same. So I cannot think of a
Right.
specific case where results were severe. You may find in the economic history many interesting cases, like rent control leading to stop in the housing construction, then to the government introducing social housing because nobody else were eager to build, like it was in Germany, for example, in the
Right.
20s. But there are many different interesting examples, but yeah, I cannot mention here one single example where the results were the most severe, because in many cases you don't have the especially if you look at the history like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, you
Yeah.
don't have statistical data to measure the
Yeah.
effects of
Yeah.
rent control.
Yeah. Great. So, thank you very much, Konstantin. I think we've come to the end of the hour. We've fielded many questions. So, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this webinar. For Konstantin, for your time as well. So, this video will be uploaded on YouTube, and some of his works and papers on rent control and housing policies will also share it in the YouTube description. So feel free to contact Konstantin if you have further questions on his research as well. So thank you everyone for coming, and we'll now call it a day and close the session.
Thank you very much, Brian, and all the participants. Bye.